Sego, if you like what we're doing here, if you support the show and you want to give support to the show, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. And if you do so, we'll provide you some exclusive content and some things that others aren't going to get when you get it. So support us by going to Patreon. Yahweh.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sego, I'm John Kane, and I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native. This show, I'm going to do something I've never done before. And I'm not going to make any apologies for having not done it before, but it's just one of these things where I try not to wear this on my shirt sleeve, so to speak. Look, there are many people who, when they're trying to assert their credibility as an activist or as, somebody being on the front lines of a cause or whatever else, or to gain what they call street cred, they'll say, well, yeah, I was once arrested, or I've been arrested 43 times for this, and this. I've never done that. And I've never done that with this show. And I'm not going to do it today either. But I've never tried to bolster my reputation by talking about being arrested or going to jail. But some like bringing that stuff up, especially when they're attempting to assassinate my character, so to speak. So I decided that I'm actually going to talk about my the legal challenges of my past, and specifically, I was put on trial. I was put on federal trial for the conflicts that occurred out in Oneida at the end of the 1980s, and that conflict involved the federal recognition of the so-called leader. It involved a business enterprise that existed on the territory, but most of it was an internal struggle in Oneida. I'm not Oneida, but my wife is Oneida, and my children are Oneida, and I lived on Oneida territory at the time, or right there anyway. But what I was charged with was predominantly conspiracy charges. I was charged with two conspiracy charges. One, conspiracy to commit arson with no substantive charge associated with it. Nobody was charged with arson. And the obvious thing I need to say about that is the reason nobody was charged with arson isn't because there wasn't a fire, but because the federal prosecutors knew they couldn't prove a case against us. If they could, in fact, even if they thought there was a good chance they could, they would have charged us. But they had insufficient evidence to charge us with committing that violent act. So they used what is considered a tool of a prosecutor. Well, we can't charge him with that, so we're just going to charge him with conspiracy to commit the act. I was also charged with conspiracy to commit riot. And that one, I was charged with the substantive charge of riot. Whatever a riot is. The legal definition of a riot is an activity that interferes with interstate commerce. Essentially, that's the definition of a riot. So it could be any number of a thing. It could be a fight, could be blocking a road, could be any number of things that qualifies with the legal definition of a riot. Conspiracy just means that two or more people, had planned such an event. Tough thing to defend, easy thing to prosecute. So I was charged and convicted of conspiracy to commit arson, conspiracy to commit riot, and riot. I was also charged with perjury, which I was acquitted of. That charge, again, completely acquitted. I was exonerated from. But I was also charged with obstruction of justice. Now, the obstruction of justice charge basically was came out of a fist fight that I was in with somebody with whom I didn't throw the first punch at. It was two other people that were fighting. I was there as that split up. One of the other guys came at me. We got into a fight, and later that charge, which was me fighting with an individual whose brother was suing me in federal court, basically got turned around. That one of the reasons I had the fight with him was because I was being a subject of a federal trial, and so that's the obstruction of justice charge. Now, here's what the circumstance was. We had pushed back, and I say we because I was among the Oneidas, that were pushing back against the federal recognition of Ray Hallbritter as the leader of the Oneidas. And he was considered persona non grata on the Oneida territory. While we were there, and in fact, we had predominantly everybody had left to go to midwinter ceremonies, the bingo hall was burned on the 32-acre territory of Oneida. And it was after that the attempt to sue us in federal civil court to get to leave the territory had turned into a criminal investigation, and a number of people, and I think there was 13 altogether, myself included, that were convicted of a range of charges, including, like I said, these conspiracy charges and the like. And this was in federal court. We had a lot of support from Native people throughout the Confederacy on our position, on the position we had against the Hallbritters and against the federal government bringing these charges in court. And we went and we stood trial. And I'll say that I not only stood trial, I refused and rejected any plea deals that were offered, and they were offered. And I also took the stand in my own defense. And that's part of the reason I probably was at least acquitted of the one charge. I was, I think, the only person that was indicted that took the stand. So again, I vigorously defended myself. I, to this day, maintain my innocence, or at least the lack of substance of the charges that were submitted against us. I did go to federal prison for, it was a 2-year sentence, but I think I got off 90 days early. I was sent to a prison in Texas, and then finished that prison sentence in central Pennsylvania. What I will say also is that William Kunsler, and for those of you who don't know who William Kunsler is, he is, in many regards, one of the most famous U.S. attorneys for human and civil rights. He only took on cases that he felt he believed, his clients. I didn't pay him. This was a pro bono case that William Kunsler take. William Kunsler, for those who don't recall, he defended some of the guys in Wounded Knee, not Leonard Peltier, but I think Bob Robidoux is one of the ones that he represented. He represented the what is it? The Chicago 8, is it? Or yes, the Chicago 8 conspiracy that was the charges against those guys who were charged with a riot at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. He also defended on appeal the Atlanta child murderer. I'm trying to blank right now, but Wayne Williams. He defended him on appeal. And if you look into any one of those cases, you will see the gaping holes, either in his successful defense or even in the cases of like Wayne Williams, where he was not so successful. I mean, in the Chicago 8, they actually lost at trial, but then had the convictions overturned on appeal. And of course, he did successfully defend Bob Robidoux from the Wounded Knee charges. My appeal was essentially a bit of a moot case, because by the time my appeal had gone through the system, I'd already served my time. But I bring this up because there are people who are trying to, impugn my character with these charges, and I'll say that I'm an activist. I stand up and I fight for my people and the people that I'm associated with. And when you do that, you do sometimes face the wrath of the federal government, especially when the very people you're standing up to are the federal government or their federally recognized leadership. I mean, and that's what we saw in, again, that's part of what Wounded Knee was all about. The fact that you had federally recognized leadership that it was abusing people and people were standing up against them. So I have no shame. And no necessary, and I'm not. Well, let me finish. I have no shame in having been convicted at the federal level or having gone on trial. I also don't use that as some sort of, as I said earlier, some sort of street cred. That's intended to bolster, my reputation. Yeah, I'm not a fan of people trying to build a reputation on, based on those kinds of circumstances, put it that way. I don't wear my federal conviction as a crown, or a badge of honor, nor do I wear it with shame. But I will say, I think the fact that Bill Kunsler took on my case is evidence that, that at least he believed that my cause was a just cause. And, even as I battle some of the folks that are trying to assassinate my character with this thing, it's interesting that they'll ignore the fact that we did have widespread support, and we had widespread support amongst, people from all over. And so, I think it's important to bring this thing up, and I won't do multiple shows on it. I mean, at some point when Jake and I finish putting together all the details associated with our first documentary, I will include this in some of that work, because I think it's important that people understand where I come from. For those of you who are listening to my podcasts or my radio shows over the years, that I speak from a place of experience. So when I talk about federal courts, when I talk about federal prisons, and I talk about what the experience is like, I do speak from personal experience. And while I will never recommend anybody find themselves in a federal prison, I did find myself. And as I mentioned, although I was pretty much spent most of my time in a prison in Texas near Dallas and in a prison in central Pennsylvania, when you get into that whole process, they have what they call diesel therapy, where they're basically putting you from prison to prison until they designate you to a specific prison. I was in El Reno, Oklahoma. I was in a small parish prison in Louisiana. They basically run you through this ringer. And they also do it in such a way that they send you far away from your home, so you can't have the family relationships. And then when you do get released, and after doing my what essentially would have turned out to be, I think, 22 months, I went in January and I came out in October. Ironically, I think I came out the week after Columbus Day, which was kind of interesting. But then I was on what was called 2 years of supervised release, and I was probably. Look, I don't know that I was the model prisoner, but I sure as hell wasn't the model supervised release candidate. I did not cooperate with the parole or the U.S. Probation and Parole very well. I didn't make all the meetings, and at some point I just stopped going, and certainly the 2 years weren't up. But I remember specifically having a dispute with the person that I had to was supposed to report to each month. And I wouldn't take him. I was working in Akwesasne at the time, and I wouldn't take him to my place of business or allow him to come to my place of business because I worked on a native territory. And this became a bit of a point of contention. And I said, look, I'll make it to see you once a month as I can. And that's the best I could do. And he threatened me. He said that he could take my case in front of the judge who sentenced me. And I remember answering back to him, and I said, you go ahead. You go ahead and try to drag me in front of Judge Munson again, and let's see whose head he chews off, yours or mine. But I said, but between you and me, I did 2 years standing on my head. I can do it again. And his response back to me was, well, what about your family? And to me, that was such a telling comment to come from, some pissant that works for the federal government or the U.S. Probation and Parole, to have him knowingly throw it in my face that if he had the power to put me back in prison, that it would be a punishment to my wife, to my wife and my 3 small children. That that one angered me, and it was probably the first time that I really I may have displayed non-cooperation with this guy, but after he did that, I literally grabbed the hold of the guy, and I said, "Are you threatening my family?" And so that was the last day that I actually reported for my supervised release, and it was probably only a year in, but it kind of shows you, the incompetence of not only the personnel but the system. Nobody ever came back to me and said I didn't finish my supervised release term. But I will say it was years later that I was coming back from Gunawaga, crossing the U.S.-Canadian border. Ironically, I was coming back because I was supposed to go meet. It wasn't years later. It was years after my. Oh my God! I think this went through. Yeah, I think I was still actually on supervised release. I'm sorry, but I had come back through, and I was supposed to be going to meet my probation officer, and they basically chained me to the wall at U.S. Customs, and they because they still had me being wanted by the police. I'd already served my time, but I had to go through that process with them, and they still, as far as the U.S. side was concerned, I had not satisfied the charge, so they actually got a hold of the agent that was involved in the investigation, and he was he thought it was kind of funny. I was actually on the phone with him, and I wasn't expressing terrible outrage to him, but the fact is that he says, it's kind of funny. It's kind of funny that you that they grabbed you at the border, and they also got a hold of the probation officer at that time to ensure that I had permission to cross. And the reality is I don't know that I did or I didn't. But I will say that I did at a time later on the Canadian side face problems getting into Canada to go to see my family. And this was years after the supervised release and all that stuff was done. As far as they were concerned, I still had a warrant out. And I said, no, that was satisfied. And their concern was they had nothing that was that corresponded to the obstruction of justice charge. And so as far as Canadian law was concerned, that charge was tantamount to attempted murder. And I said, look, I served 2 years, and it was concurrent. It's not like I served a 2-year bit just for that, but it ran concurrently with the other charges. Obviously, I didn't try to kill anybody, but so I had a bit of a standoff at both U.S. Customs and at Canadian Customs, just trying to, as a Mohawk, as a Gonyogeha, trying to go back and forth from territories on this side to territories on the other side. So I bring that up because that is part of the experience, and it's part of that experience of having gone through the federal justice system, and just so I guess in a way this is part of it's clearing the air. But again, I want to be clear that I'm not putting this stuff out there as some sort of badge of honor. I know there are people who have tried to use this And because they say, well, you're a convicted felon or that you were guilty of riot. Again, to be clear, I was never charged with stealing anything. I was acquitted of lying. The only charges that stood was specifically a fist fight where I didn't throw the first punch, but I will say that I got the better of the other guy. And that got turned into a federal charge rather than just a simple, disorderly conduct or assault charge. I probably was guilty of disorderly conduct because we did fight in a public place, but I wasn't guilty of an assault because I didn't start the fight, and I didn't attack anybody. It was more what I would consider legally defined as mutual combat. We agreed to fight, so to speak. As far as the riot and the conspiracy to commit riot charge, this was a disturbance on the Oneida territory. There's no way that any activity on any of our native lands, as it relates to a disturbance, an internal affair, should have ever been elevated to the point of the federal statute of riot. But that's what they did. And of course, the conspiracy to commit arson charge was a trumped up charge because there was probably just as much evidence that the folks on the other side had committed that act as certainly anything they could have put against us. If they had evidence they could have put against us to charge any of us with arson, they would have done so, and they didn't. This wasn't a charge that we beat. It was a charge that we never even faced. But many people will take that conspiracy to commit arson charge as somehow being guilty of having committed the arson itself, and that's not at all what the case is. So I think it's part of the reason I wanted to address this is because, look, you can find this stuff up online, and I've never even looked for it. But I mean, you can find all the information. You can find, the fact that William Kunsler was my attorney, and you can read all the details yourself if anybody cares to do it. I don't recommend anybody do it. It's kind of boring. It was never anything that sensational. And look, I am not comparing myself to Leonard Peltier. I went to prison for 2 years. But I will say that I was not released early. I did not get released to a halfway house. I did not get released to early home confinement or any of that stuff. I did every day that I was supposed to do. And while in prison, I just did my time. I do have prison stories, and I can tell a few, I guess, since we're on this subject. One of the things that they do when they lock you up in the federal system is they try to put you to work. And in some federal prisons, they have what they call federal prison industries. And one of the companies is called Unicor, and they make everything from harnesses for defense, uniforms, brushes, brooms, desks, and furniture. And when I was for the later half of my sentence, I was designated to work for Unicor in a furniture factory, making furniture for predominantly for government offices. They would have to buy from Unicor first if Unicor had them, and there I refused to work. I refused to participate in finishing furniture, and that was a bit of a point of contention. And I was confronted with it often by the corrections officers in the prison. The immediate correction officer in charge of the department where I was designated, he understood it. We talked at length, and he understood that I was there not to do prison labor for the federal government, and that I would just sit there and mind my own business and just watch everybody else. But I couldn't bring reading material. I couldn't do anything like that. I couldn't, find other ways to occupy my time. But the supervisor of that facility oftentimes would be annoyed at seeing my lack of production, and so we did get into it one time, and he tried to call me lazy, and I said, no, I'm not lazy. I said, I just refuse to work for you. I got sentenced to time, not to labor. And in that discussion, he got pretty angry, and And I told him, I said, look, now you've got yourself all upset instead of, and now you made a big public spectacle in front of a bunch of inmates who are comfortable working to do their time here. I'm not. That's how they're doing their time, and it's their prerogative to do that. But now you putting me on display, you might lose some of your workforce here. And I told him, I said, look, you have this job because you didn't have a successful career in any other industry. You got this job. Your father was a warden in another prison or something like that. And so you're doing time just like I am. You may be able to go home every night, but you know what? In another 6 months, I'm out of here and you'll still be doing this. And he got really pissed off. And he called in the correction officer head of my department and basically chewed him out. And then they moved me to a different place. But when you get released from prison, one of the things that they do is they have you do a walk around, and you have to go to all the places like laundry and different places. If you went to the library or whatever, make sure that things were checked off, so to speak. But I had to go to my work assignment, and the guy who was the senior plant manager at Unicor, and this was in Allenwood, Pennsylvania, basically said to me, he said, "Mr. Kane, I hope I never see you again." And he said that I mean that in both ways. I hope you never end up back in prison. And if you do, I hope I never have to have you in mind because he considered me a major pain in his ass. And I told him I appreciated his sentiment. And I was glad that we could part, even in that situation where he understood who I was and I understood who he was. It was a unique situation because even doing prison time, I earned the respect of fellow inmates, and I earned the respect of the hacks, as they call them, or the corrections officers. One time in particular that comes to mind was this was a Desert Storm had recently occurred with the first George Bush, and I remember having a conversation that was me and 4 corrections officers. We were sitting around talking politics. And the main plant manager walked up and saw all 3 of those guys. He just stood there, put his hands on his hips, and shook his head. And the 3 corrections officers just kind of slinked away. And there I was, I was the only one left, and I was the only one smiling. But again, I earned the respect of the corrections officers and my fellow inmates at the same time. So. It was a unique experience, not one that I recommend anybody go through, but it's also the kind of experience that when you go through a federal trial and you are convicted and you go to prison, it's real easy to come out of that situation saying, "Oh, I'm never going to do that again." And look, I had a family, I had a wife, and I had 3 children. I had to put my family back together. So on one hand, I had to give some assurance that I would never be in a situation that or not knowingly put myself in a situation like that. But one of the things that I came to learn is that if the federal government wants to lock you up, they can. They can make the charges. They can make them stick. Defending yourself in a federal trial, unless you're wealthy and you have you can hire some influential lawyer. I was grateful to have William Kunsler do my appeal, but he wasn't there for my trial. I probably would have done much better. I probably would have walked if William Kunsler was available to me for my trial. But I was there with a court-appointed attorney, and they had the full weight and all the resources of the federal government to bring. We had a 7-week trial. And you can bet it was a costly trial. Not only did they have to pay for all of their U.S. attorneys, but they had to pay for all of the court-appointed attorneys as well. So, look, it's a tough situation. But if you are an activist, if you stand up, like I said, to the federal government or the federal government's designees, there's always the possibility you could face such a thing. I did, and I came through it, and I remained an activist. It didn't slow me down. It didn't stop me. It didn't discourage me. I can't say that's the case with everybody else. I know that there was 13 people convicted, and I would submit that many of the 13 lived very quiet lives after that. I would also maintain that I'm not one of them. I did not live a quiet life. I went on to do to stand very strongly with over Native issues. Obviously, I do radio and podcasts and television and all kinds of things. So I will say that the experience that I gained from that trauma, if you will, or that tragedy or tragic part of my life and my family's life was something that, if anything, I think bolstered my my commitment to what I do. So I sit here with no shame for it and no particular pride, but having been bolstered by the experience. So that's my story, and I am sticking to it. And I'll probably not talk about it much on future shows, but just so you know, that's what the deal was. So, all right, we'll see you next time. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.